I just put together this short intro of you. I'm not sure if, I don't think any intro that we will put together will be able to explain who you are, but an attempt to sort of explain you and welcome you as well. But also, just for others' information, and Cynthia has been the leading figure and sort of inspiration to many of us who started asking, or the whole concept of feminist curiosity starts with Cynthia, and at least for me. And then starting questioning where are women is what Cynthia initiated, and is an extremely strong framework to look at the feminist curiosity in the international affairs. So yeah, would you like to say any few words, Cynthia? And I see Scott, you have joined in as well. So Scott is my fellow tutor of the course as well. He just joined in. So welcome,
Hi, Professor.
Scott.
Thank you so much for coming this evening.
Oh, thanks, Scott. And thanks, Laxman. I'm delighted to be part of your course, and I think the students are very lucky to be able to take part in such an innovative course. So you ask any questions you'd like, and we'll get the conversation going. I'm just happy to be here.
But also, to start this, Cynthia, so maybe start with, the phrase, which is one of the most profound phrase I have ever found in the field on feminist curiosity, and really helpful in reviewing, analyzing, as well as writing political narratives on what feminist peace, feminist equality is all about. So if you can, sort of elaborate a little bit on what that entails.
Sure. I should say that I first crafted that phrase, feminist curiosity, when I was giving a series of lectures in Tokyo, the University of Ochanomizu, which is a famous Japanese state university for women, asked me to give a series of lectures in Tokyo, and it was a terrific group of people. It was citywide. It was open to anybody in Tokyo. So it was a very diverse range of people. And I realized for a lot of people, asking questions or even trying to imagine how you'd ask feminist questions of international politics was all quite new. These were very smart people, but that approach was new. And so in the midst of those lectures, I tried to craft this idea of feminist curiosity, because what I realized, both for myself, but for the whole room full of people, it was a very big auditorium, I realized that they didn't have to be feminists to ask feminist questions. And what I was trying to persuade people and join in a conversation with them in Tokyo was that you don't have to be a feminist to ask feminist questions. It helps. It definitely helps. But most importantly, I think it's to ask questions about the politics of the meanings of manliness, the politics of the meanings of femininity, asking where women are and where men are in any political or institutional or organizational or economic setting. And it became a very useful for the discussions in Tokyo to really say, don't worry, you don't have to be a feminist to ask feminist questions. But once you start asking questions, my hunch was, I'm always the optimist, my hunch was that, in fact, by asking these sorts of questions, they would find themselves more interested in areas of or perspectives on international politics than they ever had imagined before. So feminist curiosity is about, because I remember when I didn't have it. I mean, it's really, for me, it's very helpful to remember that I went all the way through University of California, Berkeley, all the way through my PhD, all the way through, this is embarrassing, I think my first 6 books, without ever asking any feminist questions. And then I looked back on what I missed. My last non-feminist book, which of course, when you're writing your last non-feminist book, you don't know it's your last non-feminist book, do you? You just think it's your most recent book, and then you have the light bulbs going on. And it was a book about racism and ethnocentrism in state militaries, comparing, I don't know, I think I must have investigated about a dozen different militaries around the world: the Filipino military, the Kenyan military, the then Soviet military, of course, the US military, the Canadian, the Belgian, the Brazilian, to really try to explore how state elites tried to manipulate both ethnicity and race to create militaries that would keep them in power. Mm-hmm. And it was only when I was doing the indexes for this book that I began to have feminist friends who said, well, so is there any exploration of gender in your book about ethnicity and militaries? This is a book called Ethnic Soldiers. And of course, I hadn't asked about women at all, which meant that I actually hadn't asked about men. That really was my my own personal wake-up call, because I was so uncurious about, or didn't even realize I should be curious about, where women were in militaries. It meant that I didn't acknowledge that all the diverse men that I was tracking, both enlisted and middle-ranking officers and senior officers and civilian national security elites, I didn't even realize the ways in which I was talking about masculinities. And so I keep remembering that last non-feminist book, this Ethnic Soldiers, which I still like because, I don't know, it's probably true for all of you. The thing that you learned the most when you wrote is always your favorite, right? It's always the article or the paper or the book that you like the most because you remembered how much you learned in researching it. And so I still like Ethnic Soldiers, but it really taught me a lot about how much I missed.
With that particular question on where are women, but also sort of started interrogating the gender dynamics in the force, but also on the decision making, on the who is expected to become soldier, even looking into the gender socialization. But I if you can also share a bit what has been your experience when you ask, because where are women? Because it's such a difficult, well, looks simple, but quite an interesting question.
And it's usually very hard to figure out. So I've been tracking militarized police forces for a long time, starting actually with Ethnic Soldiers, but now it's come up again, of course. And there's such a temptation to, when you look at militarized police forces and how a police force gets militarized, or within a particular police force, what is the most militarized part of any particular force, whether it be in France or in the UK or India, what is the most militarized part of any police? It is so easy to think that it's all about different kinds of militarized masculinities, or non-militarized masculinities and militarized masculinities, in order to track a particular police force over time, and to what extent the militarization is fueled by racism as well. And with you'd think along with all this time that I would automatically ask, where are the women? But in fact, it is so hard to chart diverse men in military or militarized police forces that it's really easy to forget that women matter at all in analysis. And so I began really watching military wives. And so when I began looking at police forces, I began thinking about police wives, and the extent to which, if you took seriously wives of male police officers in various militarized police forces around the world, you would learn a lot about policing. So for instance, one of the things that we're now learning, and you can find research on this, that it looks as though, and I don't have it for more than a dozen countries, but at least in a lot of countries, policing families, meaning the civilians and the police members in a particular household, where it's the male person in the household who's the police officer, have a higher rate of domestic violence than do the general populations. Well, what if you take that seriously as an entry point to making sense of policing and making sense of relationships between control, power, violence, security, the sense of being under siege with male-dominated police forces. Whereas what usually happens is domestic violence is talked about by feminists who watch police forces, but not by most people who are analysts of police forces. They don't even take it seriously. And I think you should take it seriously. The other thing is, take it seriously because it will tell you about policing in general. The other thing is that if you ask where are police and you start in the US, you all probably have other figures for other countries. In the US currently, about 12% of all American uniformed police, about 12% are women. And that hasn't changed much over a number of years. Well, what if you took seriously, because we have a lot of interviews with women in police forces, what if you took seriously women's experience of being in male-dominated police and how they are, what kinds of units they're assigned to? They're almost never assigned to SWAT teams, for instance. They usually are assigned to things like parking, for instance, as well as domestic violence units, which never are the source of promotions to senior positions, by the way. So what if you took seriously not only women who are married to police officers, male police officers, but you took also seriously women in police departments as uniformed police themselves? What if you took those two groups of women, who usually, by the way, don't have much to do with each other, and don't see each other as each other's main allies? But what if you took them both seriously as your way to understand policing, racism, and violence? What would you learn about police forces you otherwise would miss?
Yeah, I actually haven't come across any studies to look into that necessarily as of yet, but my own experience, because I used to do trainings for armed force in Nepal as well on peace building. But my experience with those is, even if in the dynamics where certain positions are given, hardly any of them are in the decision making when it comes to how the whole policy around the army system in a country.
Absolutely.
So that absolutely we see. And looking at the women in heterosexual relationships, women who are married to police or army force, because they are quite a mobile population, then they have to compromise their own profession and they'll have to stay back home. This morning there was a picture of one of the US women officer who was carrying a baby in her arm while she was working in the home, like they were sleeping there.
Yeah.
But that's definitely.
I mean, and state officials, national security elites, they absolutely depend on women as spouses to compromise their own economic careers. And in fact, it's been very difficult for a lot of security elites to deal with women who, compared to, say, 30 years ago, are much more likely now to have their own career ambitions and therefore not be as compliant in what the state has really counted on, which is women to sacrifice their own economic ambitions for those of their husbands. And that worked very nicely for most governments in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, but doesn't work well now at all, as you say, in Nepal, but it's also true in every country.
Absolutely. But in one of the conversations, I remember we discussing about the whole issue of women, peace and security agenda. Is it about including women into armed groups, or is it about feminist peace? And I remember you talking about now, if you look at rebellion groups, for example, in case of Nepal or India, even in Sri Lanka, the whole the civil war, that had women in frontline fighting as equally as, or even better than men. But your worry was more young women being attracted towards those kind of notions around being involved in armed groups.
Yeah, and for a lot of young women, it looked as though they were breaking the conventions of gender stereotypes and but whether they actually had much influence in the overall strategic decisions being made by those armed groups is really questionable. And what we know about women, peace, and security, which is a phrase, by the way. I mean, now we say it, like the likes of you and me, Laxman, we say it as if, oh, everyone knows you can put those three things together, women, peace, and security. But putting those three notions together, that dates from, you can almost date it to October 2000. Because that is the point at which women's rights advocates inside of Oxfam, Amnesty International, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Madre, and several other groups, as well as what was then UNIFEM inside of, and now is UN Women. It's when they started to craft what became UN Security Council Resolution 1325. But it wasn't crafted by the Security Council. It was crafted by feminists. You could name them. I mean, I could name maybe 15 of them in these different groups who all got together. And it was particularly after the wars in Rwanda, the attempted genocide in Rwanda, and the civil war in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And that really brought these feminists together to try and, for the first time, commit UN state members and UN agency directors to commit themselves to taking seriously women's relationship to security and to peace building. And so the UN Security Council 1325, which is rarely studied, by the way, in any IR courses. I mean, just you all who are listening in, just try to figure out how many international relations intro courses or national security theory courses have ever taken seriously UN Security Council 1325, Resolution 1325. But if you read that resolution, it's a really interesting theoretical document, even though it's a UN Security Council resolution. The way to read it as a theory document, but to take it seriously as a theoretical declaration, is to read the whereases, because it reads very much in kind of UN-ese, UN kind of technical language. So there's the whole first section of 1325 is whereas. And the whereases are because life is like this, because governments operate like this, because wars operate in this way, because. Therefore, so the analysis is the because. Therefore, two things that the writers of 1325 wanted to get UN's member states and UN agencies to agree to. The first is that, therefore, what the experiences of women in any war have to be taken seriously. They cannot be just relegated to victims. They have to be taken seriously as having their own experiences of wartime, complicated experiences. A lot of it with violence against women, but not only that. And the second part of the commitment that was passed when the Security Council passed 1325 in October 2000, the second is that women had to be seriously participant in peace building and negotiating any ceasefire and then post-ceasefire rebuilding. So here's what happened, Laxman, because now we're in year 20. This is a very big year right now, October 2020, and feminists from all over the world have tracked the disappointing results of 1325. And what they found is that most states, delegates, and most of the senior male officials in the UN, they resisted both commitments. They didn't want to take women seriously in wartime. It's just so much easier to treat them as collateral damage. And secondly, they didn't want to have to represent women at the peace negotiating tables. So even after they resisted that, here's what they've done in the last 20 years. Those people who all didn't want to pass 1325 and got pressured into it. The delegations, by the way, who really led the Security Council in passing 1325 were the Namibian delegation at the time and the Bangladeshi delegation at the time. They really helped shepherd it through. But what's happened since is it turns out a lot of people who resisted 1325 find that, well, okay, so we'll deal with women as victims. We never really wanted to take them seriously, but okay, if we have to, we'll deal with them as victims. Because if you deal with people as victims, you don't really have to take them seriously as decision makers. And the second thing is, okay, we'll put more women into security forces, into the UN peacekeeping forces that are donated by various governments. Okay, we'll put in, a higher percentage of women in the peacekeeping forces. Not a dominant group, not as senior officers, but, we'll put in more. But what we won't do, and we hope you won't notice that we're not doing, is we will not increase their influence in actual peace building and the conditions of peace negotiations. That is what we won't do. So I've been very interested I have a lot of friends who keep tutoring me in this. I've been very interested in how patriarchy survives by resisting, and then finding out, oh, well, we could agree to the victim narrative, and we'll put in more women into uniformed forces, so long as they don't actually command the forces. But it turns out that that's not so much to compromise on, just so long as they don't get to determine who's going to get mining rights, who's going to control the new Ministry of Finance, who is going to shape the new security forces after the peace agreement. So 2020, October 2020, right now, is a very interesting time to watch how the militarization of peace building has been sustained despite all these efforts. Countries have had the most effectively organized women's movements who've pushed their governments to take 1325 seriously. So if you ask the question that way, you don't give too much credit to governments, because it really is where, so for instance, in the United States, while there are activists who have really tried to pressure the Defense Department and the State Department, in fact, 1320, Olivia, if you asked, 12 of your best friends and family members, what do the numbers 1325 mean? My guess is that nobody would know, whether it's a lottery ticket or what it is, right? It has almost no saliency in American discourse. But in Congo, it does. In Ukraine, it does. And amongst Syrian feminists, it does. And I think the countries where there's been at least the most effective pressure to take it seriously probably have been the Swedes, the Norwegians. This doesn't mean really effective. It means more effective. There's some people point to India because there is a women police force that has been deployed to combat zones, to war zones, and particularly to Liberia. And it's gotten a lot of publicity, the women-only peacekeeping police force. But I don't think that's generally true of the Indian government. So to tell you the truth, there are not many governments that have really taken seriously women's roles in devising post-war peacekeeping agreements and then rebuilding of countries after wars. It's very hard. One of the people who's looked hardest at this is an American researcher named Carol Cohn, that's Cohn. And Carol, who has followed, she's a feminist analyst and researcher. And what she's doing now is looking at post-war rebuilding economic strategies and finds that women are nowhere in the foreign investment strategies. They are nowhere in the mining licenses, for instance, in Colombia. They are nowhere in who decides what major road building projects will be part of post-war rebuilding. They are nowhere. The fact that she is tracking it and she's holding conferences and she's networking around it, that's a good sign. They track it. They are very savvy. And they really watch what non-compliance looks like. And that may not sound like much of an achievement, but actually being able to track what non-compliance looks like, what ineffective implementation looks like, that is actually somewhat of progress.
Yeah.
But watch it. I would say the thing to do is watch, I think it's this coming week and next week, or it's all next week. There will be conferences, side conferences outside the UN that'll all be virtual now. I know I've got to take part in one that's organized by the Dutch government, but there are others that are taking place around women's organizing, around measuring the success, really measuring the failure of implementation of 1325. So watch 1325 in the next couple of weeks. There'll be a lot of really interesting assessments. Just think of what a police force would be if you had women who were trained in domestic violence prevention in a police force, and you began to you began to practice a promotion system where you thought, they make the most effective senior officers. So it would take any police force you know and maybe don't love, but take any police force and always, and this you can do the same thing with any militarized force, take any police force or any other military force and ask which of the units inside it do most senior officers get promoted from? So for instance, in most militaries, it is people in units that are considered combat units. They are considered the people who are prime recruits for senior positions. Not people from engineering units, which is where most Black soldiers are, male soldiers in the US military, for instance. So take any police force or any military and say, okay, which units within the military become the prime, if you will, farm clubs, like in baseball, the prime farm clubs out of which senior officers are recruited. And then ask where are women and where are men of color. Or if it's a country where it's not a matter of men of color, but it's a men from minority ethnic and religious groups. Where are they in the police force? Where are they in the military? Are they in precisely those units that are never tapped for senior promotions? And that means you can do an intersectional analysis within a police force of how that kind of dominant racial or ethnic or gender, how that dominance gets maintained. You get it maintained by only recruiting senior officers from certain units, and you make sure that those units are filled with people who are assigned only from major ethnic groups or from male recruits. And that's what we've seen. And it makes for very ineffective forces, by the way. I mean, if you think that only the most militarized units of a police force are going to be the source of your senior officials, that means you likely are going to have police forces that have at their senior level people who are really not realistic about the meaning of security, because they have a very narrow notion of what security is and how you create security. So I think it really leads to very ineffective police forces. And as you say, how do you dismantle that? And I think a lot of what we're learning, thanks to the terrible death of George Floyd, but people who have really been assessing military forces in many countries without genuine equality, is that you really have to rethink recruitment. You have to rethink training. That is what is taught at police academies. What we know is that in the US, and this is really, you can date this from about 20 years ago, not necessarily 50 years ago, but especially starting about 20 years ago, from what we have learned, is that police academies encourage young male rookies to think of themselves as under siege. Just think how different it would be if they were encouraged to think they will get promotions and be seen as successful and see themselves as successful police if they have the skills of a social worker.
Mm.
So police academies are something that we don't pay enough attention to, but in fact, and are not the sole source, but they are part of the process of militarizing police by making police think that they are under siege from their fellow citizens, which is a terrible mindset.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think feminists, and you included, can bring is, let's be more realistic about what is security, right? And I try not to be too, well, yeah, no, that's not true. I try to stay polite anyway. But what I try to do is really say to people that are new to this is that they have to really be aware of how narrow and naive and unrealistic their notion of security is. I mean, and to really open up what security is, because a lot of national security, in quotes, national security, is about a very narrow definition of what makes a person feel secure. It's also a very narrow definition of what the nation is. National security itself, I think, is just a really flawed understanding. So I think what I try to do is I try to give examples. So I try to actually, and that's why I think right now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's a perfect time to re-educate people, because most people who think of themselves as security specialists or national security specialists or specialists in security forces, police and military, they really do know that they don't know anything about public health. That's the good news, right? But it's right now in the middle of a public health crisis that they may be open to thinking more realistically about, well, what makes for security? I mean, militaries actually have almost no uses. Governments are trying to use them during the pandemic, but militaries are really useless in the midst of a pandemic, unless you use them as simply logistical forces to deliver aid. All right. So I think we've got an opening right now during the pandemic to really open people's minds to, if you don't know how to think realistically about security, you really will not be able to overcome the kinds of insecurities that people actually are dealing with. And you can't do that if you don't ask, what are women's experiences of insecurity and men's experiences of insecurity? And we're learning several things. We're learning that domestic violence is increasing during the shutdowns, right? Because a lot of women and men are stuck in very tense situations in closed spaces. But we're also learning in the world today, I think the latest figures are women are 3/4. No, maybe it's, check with the International Labor Organization. Don't trust me. Women, I believe, are 2/3 of all healthcare workers in the world. Right? It's not just 50-50. Right? And thirdly, women are losing their jobs at a higher rate than are men, even though a lot of men are suffering economically during the pandemic. So if you want to think about genuine security, you have to think about the feminization of underpaid health work, right? The gender dynamics of disproportionate domestic violence during shutdown. And third, the economic job losses of men and women and why are they higher with women. In the United States now, you've probably seen the same figures, but in the United States since April, more women than men have quit their jobs. More women than men have quit their jobs since April because of childcare. So we have a moment now where we can actually talk about, if you want to talk about real security, then let's talk about childcare policy.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not talk about nuclear policy. Let's talk about childcare policy. And most of the people who are trained in national security studies couldn't talk for 2 minutes about childcare policy, nor domestic violence, nor nursing and other low-paid health work economies. So they're not really equipped. The national security specialists, they actually are not the experts. But that's an opening. That's an opening for you and others to say, okay, here's our moment. Let's talk about genuine security. And when we talk about genuine security, let's ask feminist questions so we can address it realistically.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let them get away with thinking they're the experts.
Yeah. No, I would like to spend a couple of minutes with you on the backlash as well.
There are some studies of this. They're mostly studies are by sociologists, by the way, critical sociologists, and they're at very particular universities. For instance, this may surprise you all. It surprised me until I was invited to be there, and then I realized, oh my gosh, I had no idea they were doing all this work. The University of Western Kentucky. Right? University of Western Kentucky, and they had me there doing a thing, and I realized, oh my God, they're doing terrific critical police studies. So there are a lot of places that are doing these critical police studies that most of us aren't, aware of. But it's mainly going to be criminal justice sociologists. I'm embarrassed to say that political scientists haven't been very good about policing at all, But here's about women and the reduction of a kind of masculinity that encourages the use of violence in policing. Because not all men who join police forces actually are of that kind of masculinity, but they are pressured to be. And that means you have to look inside, just like if you're studying sexual harassment in a workplace. It's the same kind of skills. You have to look inside and see who is pressured to take on what kinds of presumptions. And that oftentimes happens in the police academies, but then once the rookie has joined the force, look at who's pressured to take on what kinds of behaviors. So for instance, in the Minneapolis police force where George Floyd was murdered, as you know, well, you probably do know, 3 officers are being charged with murder, right? One is Kevin Chauvin, who is the officer who actually killed George Floyd by putting his knee on his throat and killing him. But the other 2 officers that are being charged are they're not totally rookie, but they're early career police officers, and they were both trained by Kevin Chauvin. And one of them is an Asian American man. Mm-hmm. And the real question for me is, to what extent, because Chauvin was their trainer, did they not step in? Did they not say, to their fellow officer, stop acting like that? Because they were so intimidated, because they were being trained in a certain kind of more violent masculinity. That's men being affected by other men. And men can be intimidated by other men. Right? Now, the question about women in police, because women are such a small proportion of most police forces, they're not, the US military today active duty military is 15% women. Right? The highest proportion is in the Air Force, by the way. But American police forces are even less than that. American police forces are only 12% women. This is after years of pressure to bring more women into police forces. And so it's very hard. Women have scarcely had any impact on the US military. I mean, strategically in terms of how they're deployed. And they've had almost no effect on individual police forces because they're such a small percentage. Mm. Now, there are increasing numbers of women who've been promoted to police chief, and a number of them are women of color. And watch them in Louisville, Kentucky, for instance. Watch them in Charlotte, South Carolina. Watch what's happened to women of color who've become police chiefs in local city police forces. And watch what they're up against. And one of the things they're oftentimes up against, even if they make it to police chief, one of the things they're up against is not just a masculinized culture. Remember, and most police chiefs, remember, are hired from the outside. They don't come up through the ranks of that city. They come from the outside. But one of the things that they're up against is police unions. Now, in my work on gender and race and workers, I'm generally very impressed by the importance of labor unions. But labor unions in American police forces seem to be the main obstacle to any kind of accountability reforms. So oftentimes, if a woman does get promoted to a more senior position, first of all, she's in a very, very small minority. And she'll be under a lot of pressure just to get along. But secondly, if she is promoted to a senior position, she'll be up against the police unions, and the police unions are overwhelmingly led by white male police officers. We've got, if you look in the New York Times, you can see exactly what those figures are for the New York City police force, for instance. Take the police union leadership and the whole rank and file police, and you can see how unrepresentative the police union is. So police unions are something we're all just kind of beginning to pay attention to, and they are highly masculinized, and they tend to be highly racially unrepresentative. So yes, more women sometimes make a difference, but it depends what kind of rewards are given them, what kinds of resources, what kinds of avenues for influence. You can add more women to anything, and if you pressure them to adopt the conventional culture of the force, they won't change anything. Just think of British politics and think of whether Margaret Thatcher changed anything. All right? That is, more women by itself is not enough to change the gender culture of a police force.
So I wanted to hear also around the backlash we are experiencing now. With even COVID, it is even increased. So how do we then, given that the feminist movement, we have been kind of celebrating some way out, some progresses, now we are kind of stuck with more pushback. So I wanted to hear more on what backlash and your thoughts.
Well, I think usually if there's backlash, it means that women are making progress. And this is true, by the way, not only in the US, but in Hungary, Turkey, Poland, places where right-wing, male-led parties are now in power. And in fact, in Hungary, the government has tried to ban women's studies in the universities. Yeah. And the Turkish government under Erdogan has tried to do it in Turkey, and the Polish government under a male-led Polish party is trying to limit it there. And that all says they're very nervous. I mean, it's not great. I've been talking with some Hungarian feminists. It is not great to be under pressure from a government to ban a whole discipline of women and gender studies. But it does say that these government officials, these right-wing party officials, they are really nervous. And as far as COVID-19 is concerned, because the there is a lot more understanding now of the importance of childcare, equitable, effective, accessible childcare. We've never, as a country in the US, we've never talked about it as much as we have now in the last 5 months. I mean, when you think of news coverage, have you ever seen so much coverage of childcare? The lack of it, the stresses, the economic implications for women and for men and for children. And so we've got an opportunity, I think. And you watch the gender gap in the upcoming election and piece that together with how women as voters and men as voters, and they're not all synonymous. I mean, women are diverse and men are diverse. But watch when women are interviewed as to who they're voting for. Watch the extent to which they are basing their voting judgments on the basis of the effectiveness of the main candidates in public health. That's new. We haven't had a government or parties, candidates, that were judged by voters chiefly on their ability to address public health dangers. This is new. And this gives us really an opportunity to broaden the notion. This comes back to the question before, I think, that Betsy raised, to broaden our notion of what security is. Don't let it shrink again. This is really an opportunity to broaden the notion of what does it mean to do security studies? What kinds of expertise do you have to really be a security specialist? What do you have to know about? What do you have to be able to do research on? Who do you listen to really understand what insecurity looks like? So I think it is a backlash moment, but it's also an opportunity, I think, and we shouldn't let it go by. Thank you very much for having me.